This is episode 281 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, as usual these days, an extremely busy lineup in terms of information, but before we even get started, I have to say that we are competing with a press conference with three New Mexico cabinet secretaries, live also on Facebook this afternoon, at which they will undoubtedly be discussing some changes, perhaps to New Mexico's return to school and health mandates, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to have a more interesting array of topics and discussion items. You can always find out what those guys have to say in the paper, on TV, whenever it comes up.
Yeah, that's interesting, Paul. I did early on watch some of the Facebook live. I called it the blank show. You can fill in what you thought it was. And after about half a dozen of those, I was like, I just can't take it anymore. And that's what I do. I read the paper and see what the summary is. And actually, you can go and read the health orders themselves. A lot of times they have some things that they don't even talk about. There's a lot of good information there. And they aren't as long and complicated as one might think, despite all the micromanagement that comes out of those. So.
Yeah, and it's with that we commemorate what is now essentially one full year of COVID lockdown here in New Mexico. That started, as we've talked about in the past, on March the 11th of 2020. It was a Wednesday, and I was heading to Las Cruces and then coming back for the championship of my basketball league. It was really interesting as the governor started to lock things down. Obviously, those orders have evolved tremendously over time. But one thing that hasn't, and this is kind of my theme, the Rio Grande Foundation's theme of COVID in New Mexico, is extreme micromanagement of all aspects of our lives, really, coming from the governor. No, obey broad rules, broad outlines, and if you can comply with that, you'll be allowed to do business, go to church, do whatever. No, it's been much more invasive and arbitrary than that. And boy, we could go into this at length, but we have other things to talk about in this podcast. But any thoughts you have about this past year?
Well, it's just almost back to the differences between when free markets and free people making their own decisions are allowed to do so. What happens compared to this 1 year and 5 year planning process that the Soviet Russians were so enamored of, and that works out so tremendously wrong. It's one of those. Should we have done nothing about COVID? Well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But the key is that when there's this kind of micromanagement from government, it's just amazing how frequently, and this is just another case, the unintended consequences and the negative unintended consequences supersede the positives that were desired. So it's like you don't get what you want in government policy, you get what you incentivize. And when the incentives are just to have the government making micromanagement decisions, a lot of people get caught, in the crosswinds, in the undertow, in the lack of, if you're a bowling alley, you're still asking yourself, you're like Job of the Bible. Why me, Lord? Why? Bowling alleys, are one of the last ones to be allowed to open when other things are opening around you left and right.
Yeah, and this is not to detract from or reduce in importance the 500,000 people that have passed away across our nation and across the world. And that being said, a lot of folks, my wife's uncle, for example, was already very sick with numerous maladies and issues that he was facing. it was just a matter of what was ultimately going to result in him passing away. And he was very old and all those kinds of issues. I'm not saying that that is the case for everybody, but it certainly is a reality of a significant portion of the people who we've lost to COVID-19. So it's every death is a tragedy, but also people need to make their livelihoods. People need to live their lives, the mental health of our children, and generally speaking, our population, physical health, all those kinds of things are important as well. And I just don't think, well, one central authority cannot adequately take into account all of the desires, the challenges, et cetera, faced by each individual. And so we get these one-size-fits-all policies that are the antithesis of what the Rio Grande Foundation believes in.
Yeah, and Paul, I'm with you. It's like everyone who has died from COVID, it's not a good thing. We know that, but the bottom line is that with regard to this pandemic, people die, and it's one of those, and there is no zero death option. There really is not. And so it's one of those, from the beginning, we've come a long way from what was it, 2 weeks or 15 days to flatten the curve to what we've gotten to today. And it's one of those, it seems like those in power are having a hard time relinquishing that, as now there's a lot more data and a lot more science. Back then they thought, well, maybe 5% of people who caught COVID would die. It's certainly less than that. They thought it would be much different than any other disease that we'd ever seen. That is not proven to be the case. It is a virus. It is a novel virus, a new virus that humanity hasn't faced, but there's a lot that we now know, but it doesn't seem like the policymakers are relying truly on, quote, the data and science. They just continue to hold on to those reins at a very micro level in places like New Mexico, in places like California, in places like New York, not as much in places like Texas or South Dakota or Florida. So we've seen, like we do often in our country, this experiment in federalism where we get to see how different policies work out in different parts of the country, different states of the United States.
Yeah, and of course, as we transition to current public policy issues, the impact of those policies, the lockdown, everything. I mean, I think you can look at the riots back over the summer that destroyed a lot of businesses. The death of George Floyd himself, who was out of work in part due to the lockdown that reduced jobs in the restaurant sector. The Capitol riots and that issue this January, and of course, just the rapid deterioration in the financial condition of the United States, multiple very, very large stimulus plans, but also now a $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion plan coming out of Washington, D.C., passed along party lines in the U.S. Senate. It is expected to pass the House and be signed by President Biden. But with those federal dollars flowing out to the states, they're propping up many aspects of our economy. Not all aspects. Some are locked down still, but the amount of debt that has been taken on in the last year is unprecedented, not just U.S. history. I think it's safe to say that this is unprecedented in world history, the amount of debt that is piled up, thanks in part to the COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the stimuli.
Yeah, and this is one of those, you need to pass it to see what's in it, tongue-in-cheek comment from the speaker here. But, the early indications that I see in analyzing that bill is a huge chunk of it is not really COVID. It's more of the Democrat state bailout bill. And so that's a little bit disturbing because, there was once a time $5 or $6 trillion ago when I started to get concerned about spending in Washington that you say, well, maybe now's the time to put the brakes on. Well, we haven't put the brakes on. We have been spending with reckless abandon. And guess what? Predictably, we're starting to see long-term interest rates go up. We're starting to see short-term interest rates go up. We're starting to see some nervousness in the capital markets, which you would expect. You're seeing the dollar weaken against other currencies. These are not unforeseen, unexpected consequences of the policy. And so, if they, what is I used to tell my daughters is if they'll slow their roll in Washington, we might not get into a disastrous situation from a fiscal policy and a monetary point of view. But if we keep doing what we're doing, it's like I'm not sure how many more fives and tens of trillions of dollars we can add to the federal debt without causing severe, potentially irreparable damage. And, talk about the pain that COVID has caused. I could see that if that leads us down to that road of monetary destruction, we could say, the disease was the least of the problems that ever hit our economy. It was all of the fiscal and monetary problems that came after that damaged our economy. So I think we're to that point. I mean, the markets are starting to think that, and we'll just have to see what they do in Washington. Right now there's not a lot of just say no thinking when it comes to spend. I'm using every metaphor that's been used politically in the last 100
How about
years.
Never let a good crisis go to waste?
You know what? And that's what this COVID bill is, to be quite honest. Yeah. It's like, hey, we needed to get we wanted to get some money to our political supporters out in the states that we could have never done under normal circumstances. So let's put it in the COVID bill.
Yeah, and we could go chapter and verse into this entire thing, but let's start out by saying that according to PolitiFact, one of the many fact checkers out there, they say that about 8.5% of the bill's $1.9 trillion cost actually goes to the direct health impacts and the vaccine, et cetera, relating to COVID-19. So we're talking could be $100 billion to $160 billion price tag. Instead, we're getting $1.9 trillion. Of course, you're going to get checks again, which personally I think is more about getting people hooked on the concept that every so often the government's supposed to just write them a check. Who doesn't like getting $1,400 from Uncle Sam in the mail? But the reality is this is a government that is, to say that it's indebted and direly so is an understatement. And just everything in this proposal, most notably the amount of money that is going into state and local governments, which while we thought they were going to be in crisis, partially due to these stimulus packages that we've already seen, partially in New Mexico's case to dramatic rebounds in the oil and gas sector that have given the legislature before the latest round of federal dollars, $300 million of new money. So we're just spending money that we don't have for projects that are unnecessary. And it's everything that people have decried about Washington and its bloat and incontinence for decades in one particular piece of legislation. Let's move on, though, because as we said, there is so much going on. Just today, it was announced that now teachers will move to the front of the line here in New Mexico for the vaccine. And Wally,
because they said they were not going to teach if they're not at the front of the line, right?
That's the question. At one point, it was we need to be in the green area of the rubric, the red, yellow, green, in order to return to the classroom. There were some that said it was the vaccine that they wanted. In a private sector business where the evidence was overwhelming from everybody from the CDC to any European expert to other states where they've had kids in the classroom throughout the whole pandemic, the evidence was clear that teachers didn't need to be out of the classroom. Kids didn't need to be out of the classroom. The teachers didn't need the vaccine in order to return. But I guess that's what their intransigence gets them is the vaccine. But if we were going to do this all along, why wait until here in early March when we're doing this? Why not do this at the outset? I believe the vaccine's been available to the public since close to the beginning of 2021. Let's get all the teachers vaccinated right away, get the kids back in the classroom, and then focus on doing the vaccines for everybody else, if that's the mindset, because we know the school year is ending in the not too distant future. We know these bureaucracies aren't very effective at getting turned around and ramped up from virtual learning to hybrid learning to in person. So it's just it's a mess, Wally. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on this latest change of direction by our dear leader in Santa Fe.
Well, it's interesting. I was visiting with a colleague a few days ago about this, and it's like, well, if this was, how could you not have seen this problem coming? Did you not talk to the superintendents? Did you not talk to the teachers union? And if you did, and decided it was worthwhile and important enough, you could have designated teachers like you did other frontline healthcare and public safety workers like fire and police. Would that? There are a lot of teachers, but there's not that many. You know what I mean? That I think that the overall what you say vaccination kind of plan, I don't think that would have thrown that out of whack. But again, back to these unintended consequences. School, the school year just keeps ticking away. And again, for those students that are good students, they will recover. I'm not worried about them. But those struggling students, and speaking of the science and data, there is a lot of data that shows that once you get so far behind in the lower grades and through middle school, you can never recover. And those are the kids I worry about. And again, anecdotal evidence, but I talk to families, and some of the families that have very high performing students, they do well in the classroom. They're doing okay with the distance learning approach because they have all the learning skills. They have higher than what I consider higher than normal human levels of concentration, whereas some of the other kids that are more in the attention deficit style, I'm not using that as a diagnosis, but a lot of those kids of my friends and colleagues are struggling mightily. And those are the ones that I'm just not sure, how long are we going to go another year? If they go 2 years, man, we're going to lose a lot. We need to get as many kids back in the classroom as soon as possible.
Well, things change fast, even moment by moment during the Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. But my lovely wife, Krista, just sent me a note saying that the governor or her people, presumably during this other Facebook Live, have announced that all schools in New Mexico can return to full in-person learning immediately, which
can
yes.
is not will.
No, it is absolutely not will.
I can lose 20 pounds by next month. If I exercise a lot more and eat a lot less.
Well, I suspect we'll see a similar situation to what happened when it was announced that they could go back to hybrid, is that more conservative rural areas will go back relatively quickly. Rio Rancho, not rural, but definitely more conservative, less union dominated than APS. And they will go back as very quickly as possible, whereas APS is going to struggle mightily to get back into, no, they're just trying to get to hybrid right now.
They really are. And, like I say, we're in the first week of March and the school year is rapidly coming to a close. And so if your bureaucracy takes 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, game over. That's the school year.
Furthermore, according to PED Secretary Ryan Stewart, his expectation is that all schools return to full in-person learning by April the 5th. So there you go, moment by moment here at Tipping Point, New Mexico. I will only point folks to, again, what we talked about last week. Burbio, Burbio. We also posted this at errorsoфenchantment.com. The numbers are being tracked week by week, but New Mexico is relative to other states really shut down when it comes to students in the classroom. 21.3% of students across New Mexico, their classroom time, or they're spending their time in classrooms. The total potential time, 21.3%, whereas Arizona 73.7, Utah 90.2, Colorado 77.1, Oklahoma 83.5, Texas 90.8. We are doing better than only California, Oregon, and Maryland in terms of getting students back in the classroom. So, quite frankly, though, kudos to the governor for doing this. But again, if this was never about the green level, which who knows where we'll be by April 5th,
Or if there'll be a different color, another color.
If this was never about the vaccine, where was this a couple months ago? It blows my mind, Wally. But again, we have too much to talk about, so we'll just plow through. Boy, who would have thought that a 45-minute weekly podcast discussing the news of the week would simply not be enough time to give these important issues their justice? All right. According to Feeding America, and this is something we didn't even mention about the challenges of the last year in terms of our children and just social conditions. Feeding America, and we again posted this at Heirs of Enchantment along with a link to their full report. In 2018, New Mexico ranked second in the nation in terms of food insecurity at 23.8%. Now, we have improved, if you will, by relatively other states getting worse, but we actually, our percentage rate went up to 30.8%, thanks largely to COVID and its impact. We were behind Louisiana, and now we are behind Nevada as well. But we are third worst in the nation. Most critically, we've seen a significant impact, near about 30% increase in food insecurity thanks to COVID-19. Now, I know that the public schools have been open for the food programs, et cetera, but if you're not getting your kid fed as a parent, chances are that you may not be going over to the school and picking up the freebies, and that's just one of those problems with these government handout programs. But I think it's an important issue. It's one of the many issues, along with children, which we are only going to uncover in a year, 2 years, 5 years, child abuse, child psychological problems. Everything that kids are facing these days has only been really negatively impacted by the COVID-19. I think you can honestly, and it's not a joke at all, the only thing impacting our children that has not been worsened by COVID-19 is school shootings, because they haven't been in school. School shootings, when the grand scheme of things is discussed, it is not a statistically large problem, because they are very traumatic, they're very splashy, they're very visually impactful, and the media loves to cover stuff like that. But there's silent crises going on with our children right now that are not being covered by the media, and this is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, and Paul, you've talked a lot on the podcast about the level of Medicaid that exists in New Mexico, and that that's the poverty healthcare system. And so, yeah, New Mexico has a huge problem with poverty. And then one of the things that the workers that have been most impacted by the COVID-19 crisis is they're not the government workers, and they're not the engineers and the attorneys and the accountants that could work from home. They're people that are out and about in the community and service jobs and other things. And so, it's one of those. The news just keeps getting worse, but this should track. And one of the things is there's more unemployment benefits, which are good, but the key is that it's amazing. I read a study a few years ago that it's one of those that you had to read the title twice. It's like study shows that a job is the best way to get out of poverty and build net worth. But it seems like at times at New Mexico we are so focused on the policies to take care of those in poverty that we actually encourage more of it and don't do the things that help people get out of it. And so, yeah, this is a sad one. There's no question about that. It's a tremendously sad one. Could not imagine being in a situation when you hear numbers like 20 and 30% of the people in your state with food insecurity, not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. That's I think a heartbreaking statistic, frankly. So,
No doubt about it. And there are a lot of them out there. It's been a very challenging year. And I know we're COVID heavy, but dang it, it's the year of Pandiversary. I don't know. We're going to come up with something creative for this thing.
COVID Palooza is
Yeah.
the celebration of 1 year.
Wallet Hub, their latest report puts New Mexico, and this is way back on March the 2nd. So much has changed since then.
Yeah,
In the last almost a week, but it is relevant data because as this particular Wallet Hub report, again written up at heirsoфenchantment.com, ranks the states based on their openness or lockdownedness. And New Mexico is 44th most open, according to Wally. This was done after some of the most recent openings, although certainly schools back in person full time, if that really happens, would change the game. The really relevant bit of information, though, aside from us being still among the most locked down states in the country, is that Wallet Hub provides a couple of helpful charts. They kind of put a bubble chart up there. Few restrictions and death rate, for example. And then they show, well, do you have few restrictions and a high death rate, few restrictions and a low death rate, many restrictions and high death rate, many restrictions and low death rate from COVID-19. New Mexico finds itself in the unenviable position of being ranked as a state with heavy restrictions and a high death rate. That is not where you want to be. And certainly our governor deserves some credit for aspects of getting the vaccine out and in an orderly fashion, et cetera. But to say that her policies have worked, the lockdown has worked, would simply be an inaccurate statement based on this and plenty of other data. And then unemployment ranking versus level of restrictions. Not surprisingly, in this case, we have many restrictions and a high unemployment rate here in New Mexico, according to Wallet Hub. So while economically, long term, we actually may be in a better position than many other states because oil and gas, once that's, that sector, we're already seeing it roar back to life. But New Mexico being reliant on federal dollars is going to help. And the fact that we're a relatively low cost state, and that makes us very attractive to people in states like California, to name one higher cost state, we may be in a decent position here moving forward. But certainly COVID-19 has not been kind, or the policies haven't necessarily done much for this state over the span of this past year.
Yes, and now I'm starting to get sad, Paul. So, I mean, it's one of those, yes, there's not a lot of good news out there. There really isn't. But I do think that this is just another example as it goes back to it's almost like the concept of base or foundational industries in an economy. Those are the ones you need to watch because as those grow, the service businesses grow on top of it. The underlying foundation in New Mexico for that sort of economic health from a public policy point of view is things like crime, education, tax policy, regulatory policy. I'm not sure. There may be another huge one there that I'm missing. Mm-hmm. But from those come the things that, qualified workforce, trained people, low crime rate, the things that help places to thrive. And so, when we throw this COVID craziness on top of those four issues, is it a surprise we're struggling as a state? Not necessarily, but we probably would have done worse than many for lots of reasons. And primarily one of the biggest ones is our poverty rate. It's more affluent people do better for lots and lots of reasons correlated to health. but our foundation makes us in a weak position. And so it's one of those things, it's like the Hippocratic Oath now from a policy point of view. Let's not do things in our state to lock in these downturns forever that came because of COVID. Let's do things that will help stabilize and our society, frankly, and our economy, so we can go forward.
Well, don't be sad, Wally. I'm genuinely being serious because.
Well, no, it's like I just went through that litany, and I was like, "Whoa, that was a depressing list of things to talk about."
But when it comes to New Mexico, seeing more people move here, and anybody in the real estate or apartment rental business can tell you that people are coming into New Mexico in droves from higher tax, higher cost states like California. And I was up in the Four Corners, Farmington, which we've talked about extensively. Real challenges that they face with the shutdown of the coal-fired power plant, the depressed natural gas prices, and generally just New Mexico's unfortunate economic management. Real estate people up there are pumped about the way things are going. Now, this whole remote work thing may not be quite as robust of a trend as some people are hoping for.
Well, I think it's going to be more robust than public transportation. Let's put it that way. So it's one of those.
Welcome back to the Rail Runner, I might add. So the Rail Runner's back in service. I'm sure those trains will be quite empty, especially with government employees in the state of New Mexico not moving around on that train. But the train is back in service, so to speak. That was a topic that I wanted to address briefly, but I'm just going to leave it right there. We have the train back, and most people I know never took the train to begin with. I've probably taken the train more times than virtually anybody I know, despite being the leading opponent of said train. But with no session in person, with no government bureaucrats making the trip up to Santa Fe, I suspect those trains will be mighty empty for the foreseeable future. Finally, on the COVID front, before we get into a couple legislative items, of course, way back a week ago, it was announced by Governor Abbott down in Texas that Texas was going to be opening 100%. Mississippi has announced as well. Less publicized because they don't fit the narrative. Of course, Texas and Mississippi, deep red states, very unconcerned about the virus and the science. Connecticut, though, pretty darn blue.
Yeah.
They announced that they are lifting all capacity limits on restaurants, retail, libraries, personal services, indoor recreation, gyms, museums, offices, and houses of worship. Now, supposedly they still have a mask mandate in place in Connecticut, but that qualifies in my book as pretty darn open. And oh, by the way, again, written up at the esteemed errorsoфenchantment.com, 12 of the 15 states without mask mandates, including Texas, outperformed New Mexico on COVID-19 deaths. Only 3 states did worse than New Mexico, or have done, I guess, to this date. 3 states without mask mandates did worse than we did here in New Mexico. So, the question of mask to not mask, that is the question. Shakespeare today, if he'd been writing Hamlet, he might have changed the whole thing to deal with masks. But, you and I have said repeatedly, we're not anti-mask. I think we both question the effectiveness of it.
And the data questions the effectiveness of this, because there's not been really good correlation between mask compliance and the places that have done well that I've seen. So
yeah, and God bless Texas for reopening themselves and doing that, taking the slings and arrows. By the way, and there's been a lot of Texans who have been critical of their governor and their state for being so locked down for so long on a vast array of issues. Compared to New Mexico, where the mask mandate shows no end in sight. Doña Ana, unfortunately, went back to red from yellow, and now They're going to be fleeing down to Texas to go do their personal business, which is going to only enhance the Texas economy, El Paso economy. But states are moving in the right direction. I've got to think that if states around New Mexico start to embrace this policy of we're done regulating people's lives, that our governor is going to start to feel some pressure. But only time will tell. She has dug in significantly and then suddenly changed direction and dug in and then changed direction. And hopefully this is one of those things where she will suddenly change direction in the positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I do hope that that is the case. And, I'm not an anti-masker, but boy, if you're listening there in the Roundhouse in Santa Fe, let's do an exception for outdoor exercise with fewer than 3 people per square mile or something. It's like there's some places where, yeah, we can use common sense. And if we're going to be in the middle of a bus with a lot of people, maybe we could and should wear a mask, but I don't think we need to wear it out on the trail where you see one or two people every hour. So,
yep. And HJR6, again, is the most viable vehicle, I believe, for getting some reasonable restrictions on the governor's power. This is a constitutional amendment introduced on a bipartisan basis. The governor has said she would veto other plans to restrict either her or other governors of the future, their power.
No, it's her. Yeah,
well,
I don't think she cares about other governors of the future.
Well, that's
good
the
try.
HJR 6
No,
would not even be voted on by the people till November of this year, 2021. And
Right.
then it would need to be fully implemented in statute or the Constitution, as it were, by the legislature. So heaven help us if we're still in something resembling the current state of affairs in March of 2022. But that's approximately when we might see this whole situation changed in terms of the governor's powers. And even then, it's a 90-day legislative approval kind of thing. So it's not where we want to go, but HJR 6, I think, is a bottom baseline for getting positive action out of Santa Fe in this particular legislative session. Now, on the negative front, Wally, now this is where I get depressed, but hey, each to their own. HB 291, again, we just mentioned that New Mexico is in a budget surplus situation. Not only is spending going up on the order of 5%, pay raises are going to government employees, at least if they adopt the Senate adopts the House version of the budget. But HB 291 would, which passed the House on partisan lines recently, that would take our top income tax rate to 6.5% now. And more importantly, it would increase, we've got this tax lightning situation. It was kind of addressed because you can only increase
real estate taxes
by 3% annually. Well, this would change that so that if the owner does not live in the place, the structure, that is a 10% potential increase year after year. And that's just, obviously, you get a couple of 10% increases back to back, and that's mind-blowingly expensive. The question is, and I don't know that this is, hopefully they at least discuss this in the Senate, is we're talking apartment buildings, condos, those kinds of things. Just because what they're trying to do, of course,
it's the rich person who has their second and third home in Santa Fe.
This is the Texas,
the
Anti-Texas Extraction Act, we could call this thing.
Yes.
And what I find it absurd. I'm not sure it's completely constitutional that you can tax two different groups this differently for the same basic activity. So I would be filing lawsuits.
Equal protection
very quickly, but. Apartment owners and dwellers have to be concerned by this because suddenly they could see rapid increases. And you're talking about, regressive as heck We're not talking about Texans with second homes.
We're not, yeah, we're talking about the common man living in an apartment in Santa Fe or Albuquerque or anywhere else for that matter.
Exactly. So HB 291, the idea that you're raising taxes again, HB 6, as you'll recall, just 2 short years ago, raised taxes on personal income to 5.9% and other tax hikes. This one would be on top of that. It just illustrates the fiscal mismanagement, incontinence of the legislature in Santa Fe. But elections do matter. And if we keep voting for the kind of quote unquote leadership we've gotten in Santa Fe, we're going to keep getting these horrible, horrible policies. But lastly, all right, deep breath. So the idea of taking out a loan, Wally, may not be something that you or I need. A personal loan interest rate could be triple digits for a year if we take out these kinds of personal loans. And I know we had Fred Nathan on to talk about this, but there are a lot of people in New Mexico, more than most states, that live paycheck to paycheck. If their car breaks down, they may not have enough money to pay for repairs to that vehicle. They could lose their job. Yes, ideally, they should not take out a loan of 156% interest rate for more than, a month is extremely a long time with that kind of loan, but certainly not for a full year. But the idea that a bunch of legislators in Santa Fe have the knowledge to set what should be an appropriate interest rate when you're talking about people who have very little resources and worse, they may not have the ability to get another loan. They don't have the collateral to put up that you and I might. It just strikes me as the worst kind of micromanaging of people's financial decisions by Santa Fe and the legislature.
Well, it is interesting. Paul, I will be very honest and tell you I was very persuaded by the logic of this bill after listening to Fred Nathan. And, you visited with me and you said, Wally, you need to do more study about the rest of the story. And that's about all you said. It was one of those where it's like, I've got to, no, that's all. You're just like, you don't know the whole story. Well, I did some more research. And, one of the things about these loans, a couple of points that I don't think Fred made is the payday lending business replaced the loan shark. The person that used to beat you up. They could afford to not charge as high interest rates because they would physically attack you if you didn't pay back quickly. But the other is we calculate these interest rates for the money for a short period of time because every loan requires some sort of a fee that really isn't based on the time value of money. So if to do the paperwork for me to loan you $100, even with the contract, that's going to cost $5 or $10 just to do that paperwork. Well, that gets factored into the interest rate. It's not like you're paying 80% interest rate on your mortgage. Now they put those fees in there too, but because the amount of the loan is large and the amount of the fee is relatively small compared to the total, it doesn't work out. But I'm not sure that interest rate or annual interest rate is the right way to do this. So, that is the point right there. And so the other issue that I read, and like I say, I did some research. I listened to a couple of economics podcasts and presentations on the topic, is that for the right person that uses these once or twice a year, it's not a huge issue. The person that keeps rolling those over, that is the big issue. And let me guess, Paul, does this legislation in Santa Fe deal with that person that rolls them over time after time after time, or does it just say, we're gonna limit the interest rate to this percent, and then that whole industry will go away?
It's pretty much the latter.
Yeah, I have not read it, and my interest is not without bounds on this topic. But like I say,
Sure.
it is an interesting topic, and it's back to that poverty thing that we have in New Mexico.
Right.
Why is this so important in New Mexico? Is because there are probably a lot of people that need a service like this from time to time. So
SB 66 is the bill. There are other bills, but this one was just voted on in the Senate, and it'll be moving to the House. Again, we just had a situation in New Mexico where a lot of folks had, very immediate need for electricity and heat. You might not survive if you are lacking in those things for 24, 48 hours. And I know that those utilities, and they have laws and restrictions on limiting when those are cut off, and that's been doubled down upon in COVID-19. But I just can't get past this fact that a bunch of folks in Santa Fe, it's the same as COVID-19, quite frankly, in the governor's management. She has set herself up as knowing better than myself, my wife, my family, you, your family, Clint, and himself, all the other people living in New Mexico during this time period, as knowing what our appropriate risk tolerance should be. Now, it is one thing, and this is changing back to the COVID topic because it's all about COVID. If you have a hospital situation where the hospitals are overflowing and you do not have the beds, that is the possible time where you do the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I understand that. But we've been in this crisis, quote unquote, for a year, and maybe there was a real crisis in hospital ERs for 2 to 3 weeks, a month at tops. I just find it unacceptable that policymakers on any issue like this are setting themselves up as the all-powerful, all-knowing people who should control our interactions, whether it's interpersonally, thanks to COVID, or financially, when they may or may not know what is at stake for people in dealing in their day-to-day lives financially, trying to get by. And yes, I wish they had more savings. I wish they had higher paying jobs. These are all systematic, fundamental challenges.
Well, yeah,
in
let's
New
talk
Mexico's
about
economy.
policies to encourage savings. You know what?
Right.
We are having checks coming to every New Mexican, $1,400 here and there. Maybe we should make it easy to incentivize them to put that in a rainy day fund, $500 of that, so they would have that in the future. I don't know. And so, I am grasping at straws here. This has been my most frustrating podcast of that I've ever done, and not because it's one of those. I'm a grown up. I try to be a grown up, but there's a lot of problems, and it doesn't seem like we're doing things to improve them. We do things that sound good that make them worse, and that is a very frustrating thing. And that's a very frustrating part about being New Mexicans right now.
You may have stumbled upon the official New Mexico motto, which is "We do things that sound good that makes problems worse." I think that if the legislature itself had its own motto, I think that might be it. All right, Wally.
All right,
well,
good.
We're going to leave it there. I'll make sure to check on you later on in the week here and see if you're doing okay.
Yeah, give me the suicide hotline number. No, and I don't mean to minimize anyone's suffering. I actually feel that quite a bit. I mean, I know people that are struggling financially and economically through this, and I know, believe me, being poor is not fun, and we're sure making a lot more people poor in this state.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have the Google Home you have in your house play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.